Welcome to Read the Bull, the only podcast dedicated to financial and investment books. I'm your host, Stefan Prelog, and today I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Mary Childs. She's here to discuss her book, The Bond King: How One Man Made a Market, Built an Empire, and Lost It All. The book was published in 2022 by Flatiron Books. Mary is also a co-host of NPR's Planet Money podcast and was previously a reporter at Barron's, the Financial Times, and Bloomberg News. Welcome, Mary. How are you doing?
Hi. Thank you. I'm great. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I just want to start by saying, really enjoyed the book. It's such a fascinating read. And Bill Gross is really a compelling figure. Bill Gross is the founder of Pacific Investment Management Company. He founded it in 1971. But the book, I'll say, is you've written almost like a Shakespearean tragedy here. It's a fascinating book. But you also make bond investing interesting. And that is really no small feat.
Thank you.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. I would say that bond investing actually is naturally inherently interesting, but I appreciate your point.
I know you believe that. I don't think a lot of other people will, but yes, and we'll get into that. So for our podcast here, I see really two stories that are really incredibly interesting and fascinating. One is obviously the story about Bill Gross, but the other is your journey to get this book published. So we'll save that second part for later in the show. But let's start with your main character, Bill Gross. You start the book by talking about your interaction with him in 2013. So you're a reporter at Bloomberg at that time, and you were covering, obviously, the bond market, fixed income, and PIMCO. Tell me a little bit about that interaction, and then what was it like covering PIMCO and Bill Gross at that time?
So at that time I was covering corporate credit, and PIMCO obviously loomed large in that space. I originally covered just the credit default swap market, and I loved covering that. It was just so much fun. But PIMCO is obviously one of the most enormous players in all of those things. And so I knew of Bill Gross and of PIMCO and didn't know him personally until that interaction that you cite that's at the beginning of the book, wherein basically I made a mistake in my story about PIMCO, like a really rookie mistake, just an amateur hour mistake that, haunts me, but it extra haunted me because Bill Gross called me out for it on the international radio. I was not anticipating that. I had triple checked my story. You get too close to it, you're in the weeds and you can't see clearly anymore. And that absolutely categorically happened to me here. And so then Bill Gross on the radio the next morning was like, Mary Childs needs to get her facts straight. And it was really more effective than coffee. And I tried to get he said on air what numbers he had, for the thing that I had gotten wrong. And it was actually PIMCO's flagship fund's returns, which is of all things to mess up, don't mess up that one.
Sure.
So then he calls me and he's like, I'm sure you heard the radio thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, I did. And I was like, but Bill, I'm having a really hard time because I can't get these numbers that you said on air. I'm trying to replicate them. I'm getting the same numbers over and over. I'm trying different share classes. I'm trying different time horizons for some reason, even though I know what the right time horizon is, it's stated in the story. And I'm just so confused. At this point, I'm my hands are broken. Something's going very wrong here. And he was like, you got to say your numbers. I got to say mine. And that was such a staggering moment to me because who does that? Who tells a reporter that they low-key lied? And to me, it's so reflective of one of the things that makes Bill such a compelling character for a book, because he has this really fascinating relationship with the press, with the truth, with reality, with himself, with the public, with all of these things are kind of wrapped up in that story. And with me, right? That puts me in such a weird position because it's well, do I tell my editor? Do I correct? Do I tell Tom Keene and have them correct the Bloomberg radio story? It was just a pickle. So I fixed my story and I moved on, and I kind of forgot about that moment for a long time until I realized that it was just the absolute perfect way. This is how I met Bill. Sure. And it makes a lot of sense for my readers to meet Bill in the same way, because it does put you on this really, I think from the get-go, interesting journey. It's much more interesting to me than, oh, here's this legend on TV. He's untouchable. Okay, whatever. That's not, they're not all inherently interesting people, in my opinion.
That's very true. And as we know, and anyone who's familiar people who listen to this podcast, there are a lot of people who are in finance, but a lot of people who aren't in finance, don't know finance. But yes, anyone who, knows finance, I mean, Bill Gross is one of the most crazy characters in finance. And the story is obviously played out.
There's so many different adjectives you could have chosen.
I know. It wasn't a very articulate one. It was just, the first one that came to me. But you do kind of set the tone with that story. And it was a great way to start because you're right. It kind of introduces him to the reader and kind of like his relationship with the truth and the media, and kind of sets the tone. So you were immersed in the world of credit and bond investing. But tell us a little bit about just bond investing in general and Bill Gross's rise as the bond king.
So basically when Bill started, as you say, bond investing was just buy and hold. You kept bonds in the vault. You clipped the little physical paper coupons at the bottom of the bond certificate. You used scissors and you mailed them in for a coupon payment. And it was just, it was very tactile in that way, very just tangible. And Bill Gross happened to start, that was part of his job, was literally clipping those coupons. And that was obviously kind of boring. Like, he didn't sign up for arts and crafts. But there was this guy in the area, Howard Rakoff, who got a bee in his bonnet about bond trading. And Howard's a really interesting guy. And I had a really lovely time chatting with him. And he got obsessed. Like, he just loved bond trading. And the idea that you could make more money by selling the bad bonds and buying the good ones and convincing someone else to trade with you and yada, yada. So he was kind of going around the country evangelizing, trying to jumpstart a market, because obviously this is a network effect problem.
Right.
You need someone to trade with, so you can't just unilaterally begin a bond market. But Howard kind of went about doing that. And Bill was one of the people that he reached out to. And so Bill goes to his boss and he's like, hey, I think we should try this. This seems fun. Let us have a little pile of money and we'll just give it a go. Yeah. And at the time, inflation was eroding the value of the bonds that were sitting in those vaults. And so his boss was kind of like, all right. And it is remarkable that, this staid insurance company, this like very buttoned up place, would take this risk, would take this chance on this random idea that injects a lot of risk into something that they depended on. This is an insurance company, so they have a reasonable expectation of when they're going to have to pay money out to their, people that have claims, and their entire job is calculating how much and when. And so they line that up with bonds, which are very reliable with their interest payments, and then they mature. And, especially the higher up in the kind of credit universe you get, the better quality of bond that you've extended. Sure. And like, why would you mess that up? Like, that's great. That's perfect. That's sleep at night stuff. Right. And so for whatever reason, they were just like, yeah, sure. I mean, inflation is probably basically the reason. And also Bill's pretty persuasive. So from there, Bill kind of realized that this made a lot of sense for him. And it kind of snowballed, I guess, is the fast way to say it. There were a lot of kind of machinations and various portfolio positionings that I get into in the book. But it ends up that, this ends up being a great idea. And they start gathering assets. They start getting clients. They demonstrate their prowess, if you will, in the bond market, particularly in Ginnie Mae's in 1983, which is my personal favorite, I guess, like cinematic moment in the book. I think it's
a great story.
Where they have this, right? It's this miraculous trade that's just like, at first, someone kind of made fun of me for wanting the story. They're like, this is just a big fish story. And I'm like, isn't that what we do though? Like, isn't that what our reputation's made out of? Right. Like the big fit, like you're not going to talk about, I mean, I guess you talk about the little fish too, structural alpha, but so I think like over time, PIMCO made the case pretty robustly that there was money to be made in bonds, and people followed suit. Right. They were early to mortgages, and that provided a bunch of alpha over the years. They were early to derivatives that provided a bunch of, like, all of these things that they just were really enthusiastic in their embrace of complexity and unafraid of innovation, like really, really looking for what the new thing was and how they could best use it in their portfolios.
Yeah, they were one of the pioneers of active bond trading. And you do describe, so it was a little bit right place, right time too. You have a sharp guy and you set it up. So they came in and right place, right time, right environment. And then so we'll jump ahead a little bit, but like you said, they're ahead on mortgages. So you detail how Gross really did see the mortgage crisis coming. And then that kind of plays out, obviously. But he was really, his status was kind of cemented by the time the GFC happened. Is that fair to say in terms of maybe he wasn't?
I mean, it is and it isn't, right? Like, he was the bond king by then already. But then I think the the financial crisis really put him center stage. Like they were so very much at the epicenter of the crisis. And he was on Bloomberg TV all the time. And every single time everyone cared. Like there was not a moment, like I remember interning in the fall of 2009 at Bloomberg News. And someone wrote up something that he said, it moved the market, which as a journalist at Bloomberg, that's what you get kind of graded on. That's one of the metrics that you get graded on. And I was like, who's this guy? Like, why does everyone care about him? Because I had no idea.
Sure.
And like, he wasn't really like a kitchen table name. In like the same way that a lot of other, like Jamie Dimon, I feel like has a lot more name recognition. Granted, he's been kind of in the game for as long, but I think Bill at that time really was one of the most, if not the most influential finance people.
Yeah.
Sorry, Warren.
Yeah. No, financially famous, right? So I want to focus on that, on the global financial crisis for a moment, because you lay this out perfectly and talk about, basically the GFC was a huge boon for Gross and PIMCO. And you set up this whole scene where Tim Geithner, who was the head of the Federal Reserve at that point, calls Bill Gross, right? He calls him to get his temperature on the economy. I mean, things were happening. I think Bayer had already filed for bankruptcy at that point. So he educates Geithner a little bit about all the leverage in the system. And then you find out PIMCO, along with others, work with the government on its TARP program. So tell me how this came about and how PIMCO benefited, because this is a really fascinating part of the story.
Well, I think, PIMCO being at the epicenter had a lot of insight on what was happening and was more than happy to share that insight with the government and with anyone who listened. So they had, Bill has these monthly investment outlooks that he would publish, and they say very clearly, he's very kind of accessible, folksy, like he doesn't use that big of words except for, so the first like couple hundred words are these like adorable anecdotes or catchy, whatever. It's very chatty. And then he does usually a pretty hard pivot into market stuff. And that can be a bit more dense. But, I've talked to a lot of people that aren't market people necessarily. And they're like, I learned everything I know from Bill Gross's investment outlook. So they are lucid to people who aren't necessarily practitioners or all that involved. But so Bill and PIMCO were out there making this case, making their argument, that the government needed to do this and that. And indeed, they were very public about this one trade, wherein one trade, it was a billion small trades, but under the umbrella of shake hands with the government. Buy what the government's going to buy, but get there first. So like, just because it's not illegal doesn't make it right or good or the optimal structure for our society that you can openly front run the US government. And that's like completely chill. There's something just a little, and that happens in a couple different ways throughout that time period. And it's just like, I think a lot was going on, and, we needed a buyer of government debt or quasi-government debt, and PIMCO is that. So there's this very weird, usually unseen tacit agreement between the government and credit market players. And it became so open. And so it was just where the spotlight was at the time. And even then we were just like, that's probably fine. Let's just keep moving. That's fine. Which I thought was weird. Like it.
Right. I think you even mentioned like he was heralded in the press for this for by a lot of people. So there were some that questioned it. I think Felix Salmon was one of them, but basically like, hey, this is a little bit too cozy of a relationship.
Right. And it's like Matt Taibbi gets so exercised about Goldman or whatever, but like, you're going to look over here. But that's okay.
All right. So there was this cozy relationship, and obviously PIMCO benefited throughout the crisis. And then for a number of years, and like you said, they're growing by leaps and bounds, right? So what was the height in terms of he managed their total return fund. But at their height, how much was PIMCO managing?
Good question. The total return fund at its peak in the mutual fund was $293 billion.
Okay.
And I want to say that was April 2013.
Okay.
It's been a while. I'm trying to move away from knowing all the numbers off the top of my head.
Sorry.
But PIMCO, I want to say the peak AUM for PIMCO, the entire firm, was like $2.1 trillion. But again, I'm scrubbing my mind of these facts. So.
Okay. Well, but after the crisis, they enjoy a lot of success. Let's say that. A lot of growth. They got they got into a lot of other business lines, ETFs, equities. And again, this is unusual for, that sleepy fixed income bond firm. But, this was, in the backdrop of now quantitative easing, and they benefited from the financial recovery. And they were obviously well positioned with this cozy relationship. But how much was the recovery, coming out of the crisis, a factor in the firm's growth?
Oh, what a good question. I think it was pretty huge. I mean, it was a rising tide, right? So if you were alive and had a fund and weren't doing dumb stuff, no offense
Hmm.
to some people, like you would be fine. Like a lot, the more risk the more you realized in March 2009 that you should just take as much risk as humanly possible, um, the better you did. So,
Right.
and that's of course not universally true, blah, 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 but to a really large extent and like a kind of embarrassing extent, it's true. And, PIMCO was more conservative on some fronts and underperformed some years. But
Hmm.
relative to, I can think of a couple funds off the top, they were just like gangbuster years for certain pockets. Like wasn't 2013 the year that like structured credit just like blew it
Yeah.
out of the water and everyone was like, whoa. And I mean, I think that there are a bunch of cases where that's the case, but like the strategy of trying to maybe not be the number one in a given year, but making it through with like stellar returns every year. I talked to a fund manager from the 90s at PIMCO who that was his whole thing. He was like, I never want to be number one. I don't even want to be in the top decile, maybe
Mm.
quartile, because that's how you blow up eventually. You want to be kind
Sure.
of mediocre, but all the time. And that's how you get outperformance in the long run. And I think to some extent that's still sort of in the PIMCO DNA.
Right.
So a lot of these, a lot of the years they rode that wave, and I think they absolutely benefited. I think they were faster to the conclusion than a lot of people. They were able to see that seismic shift that a lot of other people were, busy plugging holes in their sinking ships. The crash had taken so much out of so many different funds, and Pimlico had been able to kind of navigate around that because they saw
Right.
it coming more than others. And as a result, we're able to scoop things up faster than
Right.
others or not implode.
Got it. So they rode the tailwinds a little bit, but there were a lot of right decisions, like you said, that Bill Gross saw in terms of the
Absolutely.
environment, and we're ahead of the game there. So, okay. But okay,
Yes.
I want to deviate just a touch because you can't really talk about Gross and PIMCO without talking about its culture. And the culture is obviously, a big undercurrent in this book.
Intense.
Intense, aggressive. So talk about the culture. And you obviously talked to a lot of people who work there, but how did people talk about working there, and how did the culture evolve over the years? And obviously this came out of Bill Gross himself. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Yes. So it's funny because in the wake of this book's publication, I've gotten a lot of emails
I can
and
imagine.
and some I know, right? And a guy emailed me being like, "You're totally wrong about the culture. It was really great." And
Mm,
I'm like, "Interesting. Go on." I hear this from people have
right.
experiences, right? Like everybody's different.
Sure.
We all internalize different things. We remember different. Sure. And he's like, it was not a bullying culture. And then he goes on, he's like, it was really great. We were a family, blah, 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 which I've heard, especially in the 90s, it was like a close knit, twisted little
Sure.
family. Not my words. And words that I've adopted, I guess. And at the end of the email, by the end of the email, he's like, people from Goldman and Morgan used to come and we would chew them up and spit them out. It was such a good place. And I'm like, I think we agree. I think you just liked it and I wouldn't like it. And that's the true difference in our like phrasing and like terminology. So to some extent, I think again, I'm going back to this like one like the 90s I think really set the stage. Like it was such a small team then, and even as you
Right.
dilute the culture with people that came from Wall Street or wherever else, especially after the crisis, they hired a ton of people to manage the enormous inflow of money. But I think that the culture, the foundational culture, as you say, that stems from Bill's personality is largely similar. And in the 90s I remember hearing one guy was like, oh, do you not like the wire brushing? Did you think this was Sesame Street? Like, and it's like, oh, okay. Like that's like you get paid to endure this. Yes,
Sure.
it's intense. Yes, he might bark at you one day. Yes, he might give you a pop quiz on the trade floor or like at any time because you made eye contact with him. But like that's the deal. Like you are here for that and you're getting paid for that. And like if you don't want that, go work at a nonprofit. Like that's the
Right.
deal. And I think that absolutely has endured. There is this very strong sense that it is a meritocracy and they pay really, really well based on performance. I think that vision got a little messed up when at Bloomberg we published, it wasn't my scoop, I just like wrote it up, the compensation from 2013. And some people were
Yes.
very exercised about, yes, different people's compensation, and that it didn't feel so meritocratic, or at least the scale differential was like not quite right.
Yeah.
And I think kind of threw a little wrench in that perception, which is good, I think, because there's a lot of room for reflection as to whether or not this firm and others like it are actually rewarding based on merit.
You talk about the bonuses, and it was an eye-popping figure because, look, I think people in finance, they're used to seeing very large figures. Maybe other people outside finance would, their eyes would bulge a little bit. But when you talked, and maybe it was 2013, so Bill Gross, I think that year had a annual bonus of $300 million, right? My engineer, Claire, her mouth just went agape over here. Yeah. $300 million. So yeah, there's a little bit of, again, a mismatch, and you get into some of the income inequality, and certainly that put an exclamation point on it.
Absolutely. And it's kind of goofy, but as I was, in my time at Bloomberg, I started out being like, oh, this critique is dumb. Like, are people paid too much? Like, that's what the market's the market, like that kind of argument. And in some sense, I'm like a method reporter. So I'm like embodying what I'm hearing. Fine. And then over some years, I was like, wait, these are like mutual fund managers.
Right.
Like, these people are managing, you know what I mean? And I said this to someone, and they were like, did you just read Where Are the Customers' Yachts? And I was like, what's that? And they were like, this is a book from like literally the 1930s and 40s.
Right.
Wherein the exact same question is raised because nothing has changed.
Right.
The different wrappers that we deliver these investment strategies in has changed, but like, where are the customers' yachts? And that's a joke. That's like the foundation of the book, is that that's a joke.
Right.
Yes. And I think about that a lot. Like, that's so depressing, but like $300 million to any manager, especially of a mutual fund, just means there's a failure of structure here, in my opinion. Like, and I think Bill basically came to the same agreement where he's like, our teachers should be making more money. Like, I'm not saving the world. I'm not doing quite enough to justify. Yeah, like, yeah, it's my firm. Yeah, I did all this. Yeah, I built it into what it is. But he sort of came around to the view that there was a scale problem.
Yeah.
Not just for his compensation, but for finance as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I guess he came to the conclusion after he made all that money. So it's nice, easy for him to.
It's a good time to learn it, not before. Yeah,
not before. But that's interesting. So we talked a little bit about the culture. We haven't talked yet about Mohammed El-Arian, but obviously he was a benefit too of some of this. I think it was also reported that he made like $230 million that year. But this is a good segue to talk about El-Arian, who joined the firm in 2007. Well, actually, no, he had been there before. And I think he was head of their emerging markets.
He rejoined, yeah.
Right. He rejoined after he was at Harvard managing their endowment. And they wooed him back in 2007 to become CEO and co-CIO. So tell, because he's obviously a central part of the story. But he joined again in, I believe, in December 2007, and remained until a rather tumultuous departure in 2014. But tell us a little bit about the relationship between Mohammed and Bill, and how did it get so fractured over those, really those last 7 years or so?
Yeah. It's interesting because this is something I obviously have thought a lot about. It's sort of the central tension of this book in many ways. And I think I have a number of theories, and I have not come to an agreement with myself on which is necessarily my dominant theory. In one theory, I believe that they were sort of doomed from the start. They were personality-wise oil and water, or whatever, not complementary pairing you want. I think because, Muhammad is like extremely diplomatic and polished and professional and kind, and goes out of his way to say kind regards, best regards to your family. Like, he will just like bombard you with manners. And all of that is basically superfluous to Bill. I don't think Bill has ever asked me how I'm doing in a decade. Not that he needs to, right? Like, we don't have that kind of relationship like that. That's just not, but that wouldn't even occur to him. He's not gonna chat and make small talk and be like, as he puts it, hey, Sally, hey, Joe. Like, he's just not that person, but Mohammed super is. Yeah. And that's just like sort of a synecdoche for the rest of everything about them, where Muhammad is like a macroeconomist and he's telling you that we're coming to a T junction in the economy, like in this, the Eurozone's blah, blah, blah. And Bill's like, well, what's the trade? And they're just ships in the night, different languages, like everything about them is different. And they just can't overcome that. So that's theory one. Theory two is that they could have overcome it, but that there was a structural curse from the very beginning, wherein at the 11th hour, according to my reporting, Muhammad Al-Arian asked to be co-CIO and co-CEO. Now, in PIMCO's history, they long prided themselves on being, having this three-legged stool, separation of duties between business and investing and client management. And this would, complicate that. This would be a two-legged stool, which would fall down. And they were like so excited about Muhammad that they're like, let's just suspend that for now. And we'll go with this. This is a good idea. And despite reservations, right? And this is it takes a while for that problem to become a problem. But in some senses, they were doomed from that moment where it was just like a little grain in the gears that just over time, power of compounding, becomes a bigger problem. Okay, so that's theory two. Theory three is too much thinking about this, you could argue. Theory three is that they were doing fine and that, Bill's poor performance was frustrating for Muhammad, and Muhammad's poor performance in asset gathering and the equities push, et cetera, was bothersome for Bill. And they just perhaps it was the lack of business success in quite the way they wanted that caused this fractious turn in their relationship. So in 2013, it really starts to fall apart and they can no longer really talk in meetings, without getting in some kind of spat.
Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, working in finance for a long time, you do talk about this, how they had contrasting styles too when they talked to the press, and I could vividly recall, like when you saw Muhammad on, CNBC or Bloomberg or wherever, he kind of had that he was very meticulous and had this kind of like very calming way of talking. Like you'd think, oh, he would really, he could read me bedtime stories and it'd be great. Whereas when you saw Bill Gross, you're like, oh my God, this is stuff of nightmares. He's talking about all the things wrong in the system. And it was just like, ooh, it was scary. Right. So they did.
And he's throwing jargon at you. And like even the jargon they used, I feel like was not even like I feel like I can find no overlap in the Venn diagram of, having written up what they said on TV for a while. I'm just like, they weren't even when they were on the same page, they weren't on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked a lot. So we're talking about how they dealt with the press, and obviously I've worked in financial communications PR for a while. There was a lot in the book that had me interested in terms of how they both interact in the press. And I'll say, Bill Gross had a few unforced errors. Is that fair to say when talking with the press?
I think that's well put. That's fair.
So
I think you would say that.
Yeah. So in 2014, they invited Sheila Kolhatkar from the time she was at Business Week, Bloomberg Business Week, to come out there. How did that go?
That wasn't even their worst one, I would say. It's amazing how often I returned to Sheila's article. I know she's amazing. Like, I know that. But all the years of reporting I did, I'm like, wow, Sheila got that in like a minute. It never ceased to amaze me how just spot on and comprehensively good that article is, because it was a raw time for Bill. Yeah. He was handling Muhammad's departure almost like a divorce, and not well, not a graceful divorce. She just articulated so many things about the way, like walking past Muhammad's, like the ghost of Muhammad's desk, as if there was like the outline of a body there. And there's the way that like his presence still loomed so large at this firm, and that Bill was trying all these different like metaphors and ways of talking about it that like just were kind of weird, or It was really not ideal, but it was accurate. It was so beyond accurate. And the cover, which I think was pretty upsetting for some, was Bill Gross shrugging like this at a table, and it said in kind of Dr. Seuss writing over him, "Am I really such a jerk?" And that is just not, they'd hoped for this like shiny rebrand, like new direction. We're great. We're doing amazing. Like, here's our ship's captain. And this is what they got. And they were just like, like that is not it. Right. And that was like the beginning of a bunch of unforced.
Yeah. So let's actually.
I think for my top pick.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to throw a few out, and you can rank them in terms of unforced errors. With
excited.
The press.
This is fun.
So, okay. So they invited Sheila out. It went terribly. We have that one.
Mhm.
There was the CNBC interview with Brian Sullivan. Right.
Mhm.
There was the call to Jen Ablin at Reuters, the roadside call. And we should say that,
Mhm.
again, part of the culture too is they're in Newport Beach, California. So Bill, you detail how Bill starts his day basically at like 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. So there was an early
Yeah.
morning call to Jen Ablin. There was his appearance at the Morningstar conference, where he made some comments. Any others we should read? But how would you rank those?
You may have swapped out Brian Sullivan and CNBC for Trish Regan at Bloomberg.
Okay.
Are you thinking of Yeah, Muhammad, tell us why?
I may be, but now I'm not sure. There are a few
Okay.
swirling
Common
around.
mistake, frankly.
Let's,
People often think it's CNBC. Yeah. So okay, so I'm gonna swap that back out for Trish because I would say that the call to Jen Ablon is the number one bad unforced error. He was flustered. He was on the highway. He was kind of freaking out about how Muhammad's, narrative was the one dominating in the press,
right.
and how he doesn't have the same kind of press contacts that Muhammad did or does or whatever. And calls Jen and has this it should have been on background, obviously, but it obviously wasn't. And she publishes it. And I remember, my jaw dropped. I was just like, you can't be serious. And then I think my number, between the Morningstar conference and the Trish Regan interview, that's actually pretty tough. I think he could have gotten away with them. I think the Morningstar one was worse.
Yeah.
I thought for a second that he could have gotten away with that one. But I remember, it's like Woodstock. You talk to anybody in financial management and like mutual funds or like fund management, and they're like, oh, I was there. Like everybody says they were there. And I'm like, that room fits 600 people. Where at a certain point, this isn't right. But I love it because first of all, it's nice to have been at Woodstock finally. But also like it really was this seismic moment for advisors and for fund managers and people who allocate, because they turn to each other and they're like, we can't trust this guy. Like we don't know what he's saying. Like this isn't making sense. And I think that was, you talk about key man risk. I think that's one of those moments. The Trish Regan interview was bad, but more internally bad, where everyone was like, why is he saying this stuff? Like he shouldn't be. Like I, as a reporter, didn't notice as much. I was like, this is odd, but I didn't think that was like, that was surmountable to me. Internally it was more of a problem, I think.
Yeah. And I know they have good press, good comms.
That was a fun game for me.
Yeah, it was fun for me too. Yes, actually, do you want to set a little bit more of the setting of the Morningstar conference and just tell that story really quick?
Yeah, so 2014, he's the keynote speaker. And, at this time, he's kind of trying to get a handle on the internal politics and reassert control. And there's some like machinations he's unhappy with. There's a lot of he's still reeling from Muhammad leaving, frankly. He's unhappy with all the press that there's been about PIMCO's, turmoil at the top. There was that big journal article in February. And so he's trying to say like, oh, we're the happiest place except for Disneyland. Disneyland is the only happier place just down the road in Anaheim. Sure. We're so happy. And goes on, he like references, he calls himself like the Justin Bieber of bonds and Kim Kardashian. He's just like saying stuff that you're like,
yeah,
okay. And it just doesn't make, and I think that the like most chilling part of it maybe was that at the end he handed out business cards with the Queen of Hearts printed on the back.
Right.
And he had referenced in the talk, he like referenced the plot of The Manchurian Candidate and said the reporters are the nicest, kindest, whatever, most warm people in the world. Just like oddball references to The Manchurian Candidate, which frankly I still really haven't seen. And hands out business cards afterwards with Queen of Hearts referencing that moment. And it's like, okay, so you planned this bad idea.
Right.
Like this wasn't like a spur of the moment bad idea. This is premeditated. And so for us in the audience, we're like, oh, that was on purpose. But for PIMCO comms, they're like, that was on purpose and you didn't tell us? Like, so it's kind of a twofer where he is upsetting the kind of core constituency of his, mutual fund clients, but also internally the PIMCO exec the communications department, they're like, we can't trust you you're just not going to tell us what you're going to do. Right. So yeah, it was a lot of context.
No, that's great. I love that story. And yeah, I could just see in his mind, it probably played out a little bit differently than it came off. So yeah, that's for sure.
And it could have and the really tragic part is how good that speech was. The actual part about like structural alpha was like so good.
Yeah.
No one listened.
Yeah, no one remembered that. And we'll just say in the press part of the conversation, saying he's no fan of Gregory Zuckerman and Kristen Grind from the Wall Street Journal. They broke a lot
I
of
think
stories.
that's right. Yeah.
Good reporters.
They did a really good job.
Yeah. So let's still a little bit more to get through. The last third of the book really details, the internal power struggle that Gross had between the executive committee. And it's a real insider's view of these power dynamics, these politics, the backstabbing and posturing. I know you've covered, a lot of different places. How much of what was going on was unique to PIMCO and Gross in terms of what this power struggle?
The power struggle is very common, actually. I think you see it with succession planning across Wall Street firms, and to some extent across like startups. Anytime you have a founder-led firm and then you try to transition away from that, you lose a ton of institutional knowledge. You have this person who became successful because they're a micromanager and like intense and a lot of maybe personality traits that are suboptimal for like corporate culture and HR purposes, but that maybe contributed to the success of like all of this comes in this deeply flawed package, right? The pros and the cons, and it's all wrapped up together. And people are like, oh, great, like we can finally move on from this like absolutely bonkers guy who's moving the goalposts every 5 minutes and like causing all this difficulty. But then on the flip side, maybe you don't realize what you have until it's gone. And they're like, oh, that guy was or that gal, very rarely, was the reason that, this firm, the things that you lose are actually a lot. And the friction of that transition, these micromanager intense people are not good at ceding control and often really can't do it themselves. You look at a bunch of the top firms across Wall Street, meaning literally banks, but also hedge funds and a bunch of other, I think in every iteration you can find examples where they're just not able to, even, places where it's not the founder, it's just a big personality CEO.
Yeah.
And it does change things, the having a completely different, it really shifts the way the firm engages with other people, the way they treat their own staff. It can have enormous ramifications. So it's extremely delicate and extremely difficult. This one was a little, I covered it, and it's sort of lucky that I was like so close to it because it all happened, it really dominated my day job. So I got this front row seat in a way that I haven't had with quite so many other firms, it was such a deep dive that it really was all PIMCO all the time. But I do think there was something a bit more dramatic about this story, in part because Bill's such an interesting person and reflective and open and would tell me stuff, would say what had happened. Whereas, I'm just not confident that I would get the same thing if I did a story on, Citadel or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So, it really does seem after Elarian leaves, Gross starts to unravel a little bit more. His behavior becomes erratic, exhibits a little bit paranoia, and was focused on, trying to ferret out moles, people who were talking to the press. And again, this power struggle goes on for a while, but then finally he there's a lot of back and forth, and he tells the executive committee he's going to do things and then backtracks. So there's a lot of, back and forth here, but finally he agrees.
A lot. Yeah, almost too much.
Yeah. And so they set a meeting date, and they're basically going to, you can see the writing on the wall. He's going to get fired. And then at the last second, he goes and he knows he's about to get fired. And right before this meeting, he abruptly resigns, and he talks to one of the old guard at PIMCO, Dick Weil, right? Who's now at Janus. So they talk, and he resigns and announces he's going to Janus, and it catches PIMCO and the whole bond market and really the whole financial world off guard and really into a tizzy. And you were talking about moving markets. Talk about what happened when this announcement happened.
Everybody expected all of Bill Gross's favorite markets to absolutely fall off a cliff. They were trading in order to take advantage of forced selling that they imagined would come when billions of dollars left PIMCO and followed Bill, that PIMCO would abandon those things that had been Bill's favorite and kind of Bill's alone. There were certain markets that everyone knew Bill favored more than most people, including most people at PIMCO. Like Brazil was a good example where Bill just loves Brazil, always wants to buy Brazilian debt. And so that was one of the examples where, these, as they were called, fighter fish. We're trying to lean on PIMCO. I'm mixing metaphors. Fish don't lean. We're trying to target
Fish comes
PIMCO
up
and
later.
kind
We'll
of
talk about that.
aggressively. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's funny because it didn't really happen. These things that, everyone anticipated this huge seismic shift, this drop off a cliff. Regulators were freaked out. I remember this being like, whoo, like brace yourself. And as a reporter, it's great because you know what you're supposed to do. You just sit there and call like, there's a very clear mandate of like what your role in the world is at that moment, except that it just kind of didn't materialize. Spoiler alert. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's interesting how it plays out. I want to talk about the meeting because it was interesting that he didn't go to Dick Weil first. He had this meeting with Double Line's Jeff Gunlack, who was kind of like his biggest competitor in a way.
To his friends.
Jeffrey Gunlack, who's a very interesting character in of himself. But why do you think he went to talk to Jeff instead of talking to someone like Dick Weil?
Well, I think he had felt Double Line on their heels, especially in the mortgage space, for years. And this was kind of a competitor, yes, but one that he respected. They say that they never really like traded anything about this moniker. They're not like aiming to be the Bond King in the press, but Jeffrey Gunlock was and is called the Bond King as well. So it's kind of it makes some sense. And also Jeffrey had his own kind of nasty departure situation with TCW years prior and come out on top, basically. So I think Bill saw a lot of himself in Jeffrey, and knew that Jeffrey would understand where he was. And so he calls basically an equal, someone he sees as kind of an equal. And was hopeful that would work out. But then again, like, because they're kind of equals in that way, like that's why it wouldn't work. So
yeah, I couldn't imagine a world Jeffrey and Bill Gross working together. That would have been truly bizarre.
I would have multiple books. Thank you for not doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So please read the book. It's a fascinating story, but you kind of end it, and it's interesting because you're reading about this guy and he sounds just like a complete jerk. But then you talk about kind of after he leaves PIMCO, and it is really like reading about a divorce, first with Muhammad and then with the company, and their lawsuits back and forth. We don't even have time to get into the whole divorce with his wife and the issues with his neighbor. So just read the book because there's some really great stories. These played out in the press, but you do a great job of kind of weaving everything together. But what I didn't know was in 2016, he went to a psychiatrist and he gets diagnosed with a mild form of Asperger's. So that explains a little bit, right?
Yeah, it recontextualizes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, you put it in perspective, and I love the line that he said. He wasn't. He basically this confirmed that he wasn't just an asshole.
Yes, and I will note that in the wake of The Big Short, in which Michael Burry goes through a checklist of traits, it was a little bit in vogue in finance to say that you were on the spectrum, and that's why you were such an asshole. So Bill's not alone, but he does have a diagnosis, where a lot of the guys that I talked to that asserted this, I don't think they had a diagnosis. But I think it does, I think our corporate culture doesn't really allow for, neurodivergence or anything that isn't just straight up neurotypical and like healthy ableist, whatever. So all of that together, I'm thinking about John Fetterman today came out saying he was suffering from severe depression. But all that stuff is, hard for our corporate cultures to work around and figure out. And it's just like very poorly equipped, which is embarrassing and sad for our culture. But I do think it does recontextualize a lot of his behaviors. And I think, this didn't transmit to everybody, but I think he's I feel a lot of empathy for the guy. I think that he's just, this is going to sound really dumb, but he's very human.
Yeah. I was going to end on at least on his story. One, how do you think he'll be remembered? And is he a sympathetic person? And you answered a little bit of that, but how do you think he'll be remembered?
It's like with Mike Milken, there's a ton of respect within the market. And then like outside the market, it's a little bit more confusing, right? Yeah. And I think the same might be true for Bill, where he's a legend. No one, a lot of people still feel that he gets so much credit for like inventing active bond trading and for having such a track record over so many years. Like, you don't take those things away from a person, you just can't. So his later stage stuff, the divorce and the fight with his neighbor and the headlines that arose from both of those are kind of pop culture, like people who read the New York Post, whereas people who read Bloomberg are going to remember. I think it might be bifurcated in that way. I think, I tried to unite them in a way and cast them in this kind of broader context, but I get the sense that like normies are going to remember the fish stuff and the neighbor
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. So again, read the book. We're not going to tell you about what that story is. You'll have to figure it out for yourself. But no, I think you did a good job. I really have no idea. Exactly. I have a little bit of idea now, but I have no idea how you felt about Bill Gross reading the book, which I guess is good, but and I have a little bit more of an idea. But so I wanted to spend a few minutes. I appreciate so much of the time here. I want to get into the story about how you got this book published, because it's an interesting story. And I want to know, when did you have the moment when you were like, you knew you had a book? And then I want to ask, obviously this was going to be a challenging book. What was the approach, and how did you pitch it?
I knew I had a book in December 2014. I don't remember the exact moment, but I published a 3,000 word story at Bloomberg News that was like, behind the Bond King's fall kind of thing, cracks in the empire. And I only remember where I found an email later, like recently, I found an email where someone was like, you need to turn this into a book. And I remember being like, duh. And like, okay, so I'd already decided by then. Right. I think because there was so much to wedge into that 3,000 word story, I was like, I need 100,000 more words. And that was true. And the pitch was basically like, here's this 3,000 word story. Like, I can tell you so much more. I can the history of the bond market is so crucially important. PIMCO sits at such an important intersection. It's so influential. It's influential over our government. Like there were just a lot of gaps in like the pop culture world of these, business books, narrative nonfiction. And I don't know. I didn't want people to have the same experience as I did, where you like arrive at Bloomberg News and you're like, who's this guy? Wow, he seems important. Like it just seemed like a hole in the landscape that there wasn't already this book in the way that I envisioned it. So that was my pitch. And I think that was, you're not allowed to call yourself Michael Lewis in the meetings because everyone does that. But like that's unspoken, you're like, oh, Michael, like it's going to be like that. And yeah. Shh, don't tell. But I do think like that's the idea, is like you want the book to be accessible and fun to read. And at the end, you'll have learned all the stuff about the bond market without even noticing. And then, it was really difficult.
So was that 3,000 word article, did you have to write a proposal, or you just find an agent?
Oh, yeah.
And say, yeah. Okay.
Oh, all that. Yeah. Normal stuff. Yeah.
So talk about that, because I know the story kept evolving. So you get a book deal, I think it was announced in 2016, I think ultimately. And then the book just came out last year. So that's about 6 years. Now, for most people, 1 billion
years, yeah,
it's essentially 1 billion. But most people, in people in publishing, it takes, typically, I would say, and I know that it's not, it varies, but typically about 2-3 years for a book from soup to nuts to get published. Yours took a little longer. And if people are reading it, you'll know a lot of kind of notes about Muhammad's lawyers dispute that through Muhammad's lawyers, they dispute this, or Bill Gross disputes this. So talk a little bit about, because the book is so well researched, and obviously you did a lot of reporting, and I can see that baked in here. But I know you probably had to talk to a lot of people afterwards. So how many people did you talk to? Talk about that kind of fact-checking process and how, what the publisher says to you in terms of, okay, this has to pass legal. So talk about how you got to that process.
Yeah, it's pretty classic reporting stuff, I would say. Like I just talked to as many human beings as would answer the phone or the LinkedIn message. And that, I triangulated a lot. As you can read in the book, Muhammad Al-Arian refused to speak with me for all 7 years. And that was extremely, that was a big obstacle because he's such a central character. And so I had to triangulate and kind of synthetically create what he had experienced and what he thought of it at the time. And, all that through interviews with people that he knew and had talked to, and, his public commentary contemporaneously, et cetera. And then he obtained a copy of the manuscript somehow. And I got a letter from his lawyer in December 2021, at which time the book was already supposed to be out. Whoops. And he had notes. So we very luckily were able to literally stop the presses, retypeset the book to accommodate these notes. And like, I was really glad to get this letter, honestly, because I had wanted Muhammad to participate the whole time, obviously.
Right.
But to get these notes that basically ratified so much of my reporting and fixed whatever mistakes would have been wrong, like what a blessing. So, that's not how I would have done it had I had the choice, obviously. And we don't share manuscripts in advance. Like that's like not
Of
done.
course.
But it did end up being, and also like when I got the note about it, when I learned that he had obtained a copy, I was like, oh my God, who's the leak here? Like who did?
Right.
And then I was
Right.
like, this is Bill Gross's path. Like, don't go down this road. Um, but I do think that it benefited greatly from getting that letter, and I'm so glad. But it was hard. I mean, that was incredibly stressful. And for every person that talked to me, there were like 3 that said mean things. So it was a slog. And I think it's better for it. It's much better for it. And yes, Bill Gross kept changing the narrative over time. He would do a new thing and I have to change the story, and it recast the whole thing sometimes. And that was frustrating, but it's a way more interesting book than the one I would have written in 2015 or 16. So
yeah, that's
can't
great.
say I'm happy about that. Like I wish I had taken 2 years, but
well, it's a great result.
I'm glad it's a better book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. So anyway, that's your time on Read the Bull. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And anything else you want to talk about and plug? You do. Please also tune into NPR.
Planet Money.
Yeah, awesome. Mary Childs, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.